And mute is now off. So those of you in the channel, we are live. Please feel free to let us know how the audio is sounding for you. This is the Kubernetes office hours for the Western edition. For those of you on the West Coast time zone, I'm going to give you a quick intro, introduce our panels, and then let you know how this works. So the way this works is we sit and hash office-hours in Slack, on the Kubernetes Slack, and then just basically ask your question, prepend it with question, and then I will read it to our esteemed panel of experts, and then you'll hopefully get your answers. There are some cases where they might ask you a question. We'll go ahead and give you time to respond, and then loop around to you. As far as the questions, if you look at the link on the top of the Office Hours channel, it kind of gives you some pro tips on how to ask good questions. And then let's get started. So first, let's introduce our lovely panelists. Why don't we go Craig, Joe, and then Mario? How about that for introductions?
Can you guys hear me?
Can you guys hear me?
Yep. We can hear you, Arun. I think the question is whether the stream can hear you.
There it is.
Yeah.
Everyone can hear.
Everyone.
Yay, awesome.
Yes.
Awesome. All right.
Exciting.
All right. So luckily, we've had the questions start to pile up, so we can just get started, and then we'll loop back to during one of the dead times, Joe, for your opinions on Ingress. Sound good? Sean asks, question, is it possible to isolate a pod in a cluster for specific testing / flags? Let's say I want to get some extra metrics around the health, performance of the pod on the side in production.
So I got to ask a question. Is this the idea is that you want to run, say, like a deployment or a replica set, and you want to have one of the pods be special? I mean, one of the pods in that replica set be special because you want to essentially maybe quarantine it or debug it. Is that the idea? Or are you thinking different flags in terms of the Docker daemon underneath the covers that this thing is talking about? If it's the first one, Sean, and then Sean, later you said...
It sounds like it's the first one.
One pod in a replica. Okay. Yeah, so what I would actually say is you can get fancy here. And this is one of the reasons why we separated out the idea of deployments and replicas from services. What you can do is using labels is that you can run a separate deployment for that special pod, and you can have it actually have a subset, or it can have a set of labels that expands beyond the set of labels that the service is targeting. So you can have a service target multiple deployments or multiple replica sets. And so you can have like a canary or a debug replica set, and then you can have your regular or deployment, and then you can have your regular deployment, which has type equals normal or something like that in a label. And then you just don't include the type label when you're actually defining the service. And so that service covers both of those deployments. Another interesting technique that you can do here is, like, let's say that you're running a service with a deployment / replica set, and you start getting 500s, and you track it down, and those 500s are only one of the pods that you're running. And you're like, so now, like, you're in this situation, and we've all been in this situation where it's like, okay, I can kill and restart that thing, and I'm pretty sure that it'll come back and it'll be healthy, but I'm going to lose all the context, so it's going to be really hard for me to debug what's going on and figure out what's happening. So a lot of times in production, you're in this really awful choice where you either throw away state that you want to debug, or, you know, to get the thing up and running, or you sit there and you debug it live, and meanwhile, like, maybe a tenth of your requests are coming back as 500s. One of the things, again, by playing games with labels, you can actually play with here is you can remove labels from that pod to essentially quarantine it. And as you remove the labels from that pod, two things will happen. Number one is it'll no longer be targeted by the service. And then number two, your replica set, / deployment will actually spin up a replacement for that thing. So you can essentially orphan or quarantine this thing. Now you have something that you can start poking at directly, and the rest of the deployment actually continues, like, brings itself back up to full strength, and you're ready to go. The one thing to be careful of is, like, make sure you delete that pod because nobody else is going to. But that's, if you dynamically edit labels, you can essentially sort of move stuff around and change what's happening where. Does that help answer that question for you, Sean?
And he's typing. Awesome answer. Thumbs
right,
up.
cool.
Do Mario or Arun, do either of you have opinions on this?
I just wanted to mention that, yeah, I can't talk today. The ephemerality of pods, like the idea that, you don't really want pods to be special. And like Joe was saying, it's going to stick around, or if you're looking at the logs and whatnot of the pod, and that's the same with jobs, right? If a job runs, I believe the pod actually sticks around so that you can look at the contents. It doesn't go away. And we actually just had a thing where we were wondering how to handle the cleanup there. And whatnot. That might be another question, or it's a matter of writing your own microservice to handle that. But yeah, just being careful of things that are being left around, and that goes into your processes at your company or whatever that you're trying to achieve. So that's all I had to add. Joe, if there's any other places for documentation for,
So
it looks like added that, but yeah, that'd be nice to know as well.
there is another aspect that I will add to this. I think the question also said, if I can narrow down a pod to a node, I think that will be that much harder. Yes, you can narrow down to a pod, but if the pod gets terminated for some reason, it's a rogue pod, comes on a different host, so you can't really nail it down to a node by itself. By using the technique that Joe was talking about, assigning labels, yes, you can narrow down to the pod, but having that pod and node association would be that much harder to track.
Yeah, I think when at all possible, you don't want to use scheduler features that lock you down to a specific specific host. That's to be avoided if you can help it.
Yeah, and Arun, can you introduce yourself real quick, since we had trouble with the Zoom meeting here?
I certainly can. Yeah, my name is Arun Gupta. I work for Amazon Web Services. I'm one of the principal open source technologists. My focus here is exclusively on open source and container frameworks, and I'm also the board rep for CNCF.
Oh, great. Awesome. Thanks for joining. Next question is, and also thanks to Ed there for digging up the labels documentation and tossing that in Slack. We certainly appreciate when people do that.
I also wrote the chapter on the Kubernetes up and running book on labels and annotations. So
which you can pick up at resellers everywhere if you want. There. Yes.
It's available on Amazon, so you can
Did you also decide the animal on the front cover?
No, that was all Kelsey. And I'm pretty sure it's an orca killer whale, but if you actually look in the book, it says it's a type of dolphin.
Yeah, so it says it's a bottlenose. I thought it was a false killer whale at first, being a cetacean fan, but I was also
typically O'Reilly does not let you pick the animal. They pick the animal. They have their own art and design department.
I don't know, if it would have been my book, it would have been the honey badger.
Yes.
Yes. So Lax77 writes in, thanks for joining. I have a question regarding how to wire and manage resources like RDS, Elastic Cache, etc., provision through Terraform into Kubernetes. Is there a good pattern I could use here?
I can take that if unless other folks want to.
Go for it, yeah, go for it.
So there's two things here. So this is in some ways the idea behind the service broker effort that's been ongoing for a while, right? Service broker is a way to say, give me a service that does X, let me find it, and then give me the credentials so that I can talk to it. Now that is still early work. It's being driven as a partnership between the Kubernetes group. There's a SIG that's driving that, and there's this common API between that and the Cloud Foundry Foundation. And so trying to find some commonality between Kubernetes and Cloud Foundry there. It's still very early, and I think, like you were saying, hey, can you mute, George? I can hear you typing, man. But you were saying that you're bringing these things up with Terraform, and so there's really two questions here in terms of how do you hook that up. The first is how do you find it, and then the second question is how do you authenticate to it. When it comes to how do you find it, you can, if it's wired into the DNS that the rest of your cluster is using, you can go ahead and actually talk to that directly. If you want to use sort of native Kubernetes stuff to be able to find it, you can create these things called external services, and you can address those either by name or by editing the endpoints object directly. You could populate it with the IP addresses that you can use to find this thing. And so that's a way to essentially import external services into the sort of services model that's already there in Kubernetes. This is not super well documented. This is something that's kind of been on my list that I've wanted to actually go in and talk about more formally in terms of how do you actually import external services. When it comes to how do you authenticate to these things, I think there's a set of choices. If you're running on Amazon and AWS, there's, obviously it's well integrated if you're calling from a VM into something like DynamoDB or RDS or what have you. If you're running on Kubernetes, there's a project called Kube to AIM, which essentially lets you assign IAM roles to Kubernetes pods. It's a good place to start. It is from a security point of view, it's not as good as it could be. But if you're running a relatively sort of single purpose cluster, it's probably pretty acceptable. If you're running a large multi-tenant clusters with a bunch of different people and you want to protect them and like really think about how, what happens if nodes get compromised by somebody else, then it's worthwhile to look a little bit deeper into that. The other option is that you can store credentials either in Kubernetes secrets or you can store them into something like HashiCorp Vault, which is very common. If you're storing them in Vault, then it's a question of like, well, how the heck do you authenticate to Vault? There's a Kubernetes authenticator for Vault that uses a service account tokens to be able to do it. But honestly, at that point, it's not that much better than storing them as secrets themselves. And the pattern for how you authenticate to Vault involves giving them credentials that let Vault access as you towards the Kubernetes API. So it sort of extends your sort of cordon of security to include Vault also, which is probably not insane, but it's not a great pattern. So hopefully that gets to some of the techniques here. I don't think there's a great guide in terms of like the different ways of importing external services, and I think that there's a real need there.
Mm-hmm. Anyone else have opinions on using?
Yeah, my only take is that OpenShift broker, or the Open Service broker is the way to go. Essentially, look at it on how that integration can be done. Particularly, if you have already resources in Amazon. So look at, that work again, as Joe said, is in the very early stages. So as the time moves on, you should be able to see that how, think about your Kubernetes cluster running on Amazon, having a single set of credentials. One thing I also want to talk about is Kubernetes AWS Authenticator, which is a Heptio Labs project as well. So essentially what you're looking at is end-to-end, security using IAM credentials, particularly in the AWS land. So you want to use the same IAM role possibly to authenticate to the Kubernetes cluster using kubectl. Then you can have a similar role, doing your pod identity on the cluster, and then eventually having enough permissions in that IAM role to be able to authenticate to other services as well. So I think that's something that you want to keep track of.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so the project that Arun mentioned is something that Moyer, one of the security engineers here at Heptio, wrote. And it's something that we're going to be putting a little bit more shine on to get more folks to polish it up a little bit. But it essentially lets you use IAM to authenticate to your cluster, and then Kube.IAM lets you use your cluster to authenticate to AWS.
So, Joe, my question would be, how does Spiffy Spire kind of fit into this scenario, particularly when you're using external services like RDS?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So the first thing is, so for those who aren't aware, there's this project that was just submitted for consideration to be a CNCF project called Spiffy. I started this before I started Heptio. There's a company run by a friend of mine that's developing the product called Cytail. It's called Spiffy, S-P-I-F-F-E, and you can go to spiffy.io if you want to read details about that. Basically what it is and it's inspired by the way that Google handles identity in their production systems. It's a way to assign identity in the form of currently X509 certificates that let you, essentially have a job come up on Kubernetes, come up on Mesos, come up on Swarm, come up on raw VMs, and map that to some identity that can then be used to actually do microservice to microservice authentication. So it solves the problem of like when service A calls service B, how does B know that it's actually A that's calling? So that's the goal of what we want to get out of that. Couple of things that with this conversation with Spiffy to keep in mind. One way to look at a secret store like Vault is it's really an identity translation service, right? Most of the time what you do is you talk to Vault and you say, here's some identity, translate that into another identity for me, right? Because most of the time the secrets that you're getting out of it, you can then use to further authenticate to something else. And the reason you need an identity translation service is that we don't have a good common way of identity. Each system has their own individual idea of identity. And where we do have a common idea of identity, like if you take a look at AWS or Google or Azure or whatever, it's very difficult to actually use that identity between two peers without having that thing actually sit in the middle. And so this is something that honestly is very difficult to do with IAM today. I think Microsoft's probably a little bit ahead because they have Active Directory to lean on, which has sort of like, done this stuff forever. Spiffy is sort of meant to be an interchange format to be able to do that. So you won't be able to use the Spiffy IDs to talk to AWS directly unless AWS wants to actually start accepting them. Hint, hint, nudge, nudge, Arun. But what you could do is you could run some identity translator, like say Vault. You could then use in the fullness of time, you could then use Spiffy to talk to Vault. Vault knows how to actually mint tokens using the STS service with AWS, and then return those to you. So you start viewing your secret store as an identity translation service.
Right. I think that gives a really good context, because end of the day, you're looking at, yes, the question was probably more targeted towards RDS, but essentially you could apply that concept of Vault as an identity translator with Spiffy particularly, and how you can do cross-cloud, for example. If let's say clusters are running across multiple clouds, how you can use that as identity translator.
And in the fullness of time, I would love to see the clouds actually root things like Spiffy in sort of special access and special permissions and hardware that they can run, right? So at some point, that the Spiffy identity ends up getting rooted on something that is baked into a chip somewhere in hardware, and that there's a really good chain of custody or attestation of the stack, right? That's kind of the world that we want to build towards. Mm-hmm. Identity is hard. It's really hard.
Yeah. So moving on, because we got the questions are starting to pile up. Big Willie asks, I'm trying to understand Fiber Channel on Kubernetes. I've read the PV and PVC docs on the Kate's website, but I'm still lost. Does anybody have any good tutorials or anything to learn from?
So I'd be interested in hearing a little bit more about what type of product or service he's trying to use. Fiber Channel in and of itself is just a networking technology. I'm guessing he's trying to achieve storage, so some sort of SAN backend. So I'd be interested in hearing a little bit more about that, what he's trying to do.
Yep. Willie, if you could go ahead and just give us a little bit more information. He says he's using a Pure Array. Never heard of that.
Yeah, Pure.
Do we have anybody with expertise on that? Or I can definitely write that down and then maybe ask someone from Six Storage if we can loop back on that one.
Yeah, I think this is actually one of those interesting things where I think because Kubernetes is so, it was kind of born in the cloud to some degree. It's been very difficult for us to test and validate and sort of get wide usage of things that integrate with particular vendor products, especially when those things are on-prem. I think, another example of where we've had a hard time getting progress is around, say, IPv6. There's some early work around IPv6 being driven by some folks at Cisco. But the truth of the matter is that we don't have great cloud solutions for testing out IPv6. I was so excited when AWS announced their support, but it's just not quite there. They don't actually give you a range of IP addresses that you can then assign to pods. It's really something that is sort of a onesie-twosie type of thing. And so anytime where we can't do continuous integration testing and have it sort of be a democratized technology that a lot of people can get their hands on, it's been very difficult to actually get us critical mass of support around those things.
Yeah.
Yeah, the packet stuff is interesting, and I think it's worthwhile. The other thing that people are doing around IPv6 is running nested virtualization on both Azure and GCE right now. All right, so I just got a warning saying that our meeting will end in 10 minutes because we couldn't figure out how to actually.
Yes. So when when it kicks us off, everyone on the live stream just chill out for 10 seconds or so, and then we'll rejoin and continue. So he says, I don't really need native integration. I would just like to understand more generally using fiber channeling Kubernetes, maybe at a high level. The hardware looks nice. I'm looking at one now with like NVMe and stuff. So if I'll go ahead, Willie, I'll follow up with you after the meeting, and I'll ask someone in SIG Storage if we can maybe find a way to get you started here.
Yeah, Ed linked a GitHub README in the Kubernetes examples repo, which is probably the closest you're going to find about it. Looks like it's more so just some notes that someone kind of took here on doing this. So it seems like this might actually be possible, but yeah, someone from SIG Storage would definitely have more of a better idea. And the question too is, is this something that you'd want to actually do in production for, systems that are running live workloads and whatnot? So
yeah. So. Okay. Moving on. Iru asks, is there a plan in place for moving host mount propagation forward? It's a feature we're extremely eager to use. It's blocking our main usage of Kubernetes, actually. There's a note in the source code. This field is alpha 1.8 and can be reworked or removed in the future. Any plans on removing it? I hope not. Or formalizing it? I hope so. I am totally unfamiliar with this.
I have no idea.
I'm looking it up now. You hear me. So I think one thing to keep in mind is that, like, when things are marked alpha by Kubernetes, the alpha beta, and it's on my list to write something up here to make it more clear. The difference between alpha, beta, and GA is relatively conservative in Kubernetes, right? And so I think the whole idea of backward compatibility and signing up for something for the long term is something that Kubernetes takes very seriously. So just having something be in actually be in in alpha doesn't mean that thing is necessarily unstable or is going to be removed. But I think it's just a matter of, like, we don't want people planning on it for the long term.
Yep. What SIG would handle this? Like, it sounds like something like a SIG would want to know if someone's really looking for a feature.
I would check to see. Gosh, the 1.9 planning, if anybody's talking about it with planning.
Okay. So I will write this down, and I will definitely follow up here.
One of the things I would say about alpha features, though, is like, once you get into beta, then you're in a pretty solid shape. Not likely to break backwards compatibility, and that's the thing with alpha features. Like, for example, we have stateful sets now. The schema has evolved from alpha to beta, and the API is much more solid. So the names could evolve, the APIs could change, and that's sort of the idea behind alpha, essentially, that it's a warning that, okay, don't use it in production today. If things change, be ready to evolve, essentially.
Mm-hmm. So I have two things to ask SIG Storage then next time I hang out with them. So Big Willie and Iru, just follow up with me afterwards. I'll make sure I point you to at least the right people, so you have a place to go. Moving on, next question. One of my favorites. Any good links/docs on doing manual HA for kubeadmin while we wait for the feature to be completed in kubeadmin itself?
George, I did answer that pretty much in text, but this is something that we are working on Heptio, and one of the deliverables will be a blog post or some documentation around this, but it's in the works.
Okay. How are people doing? Like, do you do it by hand?
We have a CloudFormation template, so we are writing a brand new workshop, which is Kubernetes on AWS workshop. Mm-hmm. And as part of that, we do have a CloudFormation template. that CloudFormation actually uses kubeadm, and through that we tell you exactly how do you install a cluster. But until that feature for HA is available in kubeadm itself, we just use a CloudFormation to do a single master cluster at this point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we have at Heptio, we also have the AWS Quick Start, which is the same. Sounds pretty similar to what AWS has. It also is one master, multiple worker nodes. The question in particular, though, I think was around on-prem.
And I think the point that you made about that you're working on a blog post to do kubeadm, I think one of the key questions to ask over there is that a blog or is that a functionality that's going to be integrated into kubeadm to enable HA?
Yeah, so this was also posted in text. This work is currently ongoing in SIG cluster lifecycle to add HA capabilities to kubeadm. Mm-hmm. It's just not quite there yet.
Yep. And for those of you who haven't tried it in a while, kubeadmin now supports in-place upgrades. So I just did a blog post on that the other day. You're able to move up point releases, or you can move up major versions in place. So literally, I think HA is like the one last thing people are really waiting on, and then it will be kubeadmin happiness for everybody, forever. Have I missed any questions, audience? If I have, please repeat it. If you could, or we have new questions, please feel free. We have about 20-ish minutes left. SR Matto asks, hi, what are some recommended tools for managing the lifecycle of Kubernetes primitives, deployments, services, etc.? I'm currently writing a Python app which is backed by database, which should meet our needs. Just curious what others out there are using.
So this is a super deep topic.
Yeah.
So I think so we have a working group where we're talking about application definition. How do people actually manage applications, defining what their applications look like? And then there's the question of how do they then go ahead and actually push those to the cluster. So there's the application definition, and then there's the application deployment. I think Helm is a great example of sort of the integrated experience you can bring around a bunch of this stuff. But I think what we're finding is that there's a whole host of different needs in terms of what people need here. I think the idea that you want to move the source of truth of what should be running in your cluster out of the cluster into something that is more purpose-built for that. And I think, for many people, this will be Git, right? Well, they'll actually have a bunch of files checked into Git, whether it's raw YAML or whether it's something that is essentially compiles down into YAML. And so at Heptio, we have a thing that we're working on called KSonnet, but there's tons of ways to skin that cat. I think the idea of using a database to drive that is really interesting itself, right? And I think there are a lot of cases where you have a database that stores stuff, and then you have a controller that then uses that to actually drive what should be running. So like we could create a theoretical Minecraft server which uses a database to say which Minecraft server should I be running and where are the data stored, and automatically starts and stops those based on people clicking stuff in a GUI and writing it into a database, right? So in that way, you're starting to build an application that is really bound into Google, and bound into Kubernetes, and you're blurring the lines between defining your application, having your application define itself. I think that gets to some of that question there, hopefully. For KSonnet, I think specifically, we're going to be doing a lot of stuff new for KubeCon, and so expect a big update there. Don't judge it by what's there now. We got a lot of exciting stuff coming.
Anybody in the audience, feel free to, toss out links to tools that you've used and that you've preferred. Anybody else have opinions on?
We're about to be cut off, George. I upgraded your Heptio Zoom account to the Pro version. I thought that might fix it. But well, I don't know.
It hasn't kicked us off yet, so I have the URL ready, so it shouldn't be too much of an interruption.
George, if we kick out, then we just wait here and it automatically reconnects us?
I don't know. I haven't experienced this before.
Yeah, I believe so, but I have the Zoom URL standing by if...
Okay, gotcha.
We need a Zoom engineer in this chat, I think, just with us all the time, just in case.
Yeah.
Well, it's so funny because products like Zoom are really built for a single company. You start using this stuff, in a sort of like very disconnected, loosely coupled world, and you start seeing where all the creaky edges are.
Yeah.
Well, like actually, a couple of years back, blue jeans used to be a big thing, but I don't see much of blue jeans now. I'm seeing more of Zoom, so I've definitely seen more popularity here.
Yeah, we just have to make sure
AWS
everybody's.
has Chime. So when are we going to switch everything to Chime, Arun?
All right, stand by. Stand by while we. Invalid meeting ID. Oh no. 1 second. Please bear with us here. Looks like. All right. Let me just get everybody else in here, and we will be back. All right.
All right, I'm back. Sorry, everybody. Oh, now it's not limited, so it looks like my upgrade fixed it for you.
Oh, did you upgrade my account? Thank you.
Yeah, I upgraded you to the Pro version. But apparently we had to restart the meeting to actually get that to kick in. If I'd known, we would have done that before we started. But
and I've set the invite.
We're doing enough of this stuff now. We can we can go there.
Now let me see. Just waiting on the other two. And Mario's back, and I've sent the link to Arun, but he was dialed in, wasn't he?
Yeah, he was on the phone.
Yeah. So let's see how that works. I wonder if you could URL hack. People watching the stream, how's the audio? Hopefully everyone can hear everybody.
I hope so.
Sorry about that interruption. But we have fixed the glitch.
All right, so Ed was asking about the IPv6 issues. I think it's being driven by SIG networking, and I can try and find the folks who are driving that.
Whoa.
Mario, you are loud.
Sorry.
Someone upgraded their cherry switches. Definitely.
Okay, Arun, I got feedback on Chime, man. I can tell you. Let's see, authenticating to your cluster with IAM. I can send you that link. Give me a second. I can look that up.
Yeah, so let's deal with IPv6, and then I'll find the link for the IAM.
Okay, so IPv6, so a couple of caveats. It's still very early. Most of the prototypes are being driven using Docker and Docker Kubernetes cluster, which is this thing that some Rantis folks put together for essentially doing development around Kubernetes. The real caveat there, and this is really unfortunate, and this is probably to some degree my fault, is that the original way that we set up networking in Kubernetes is that we assume that each pod has one and only one IP address, which means that doing dual stack is not something that is easy to plumb in for Kubernetes right now. And by dual stack, I mean giving a pod both an IPv4 and a v6 address. And so the work that's been going on so far is actually single stack, giving a pod a single IPv6 address versus a dual stack type of thing. And then doing a bunch of translations to the outside world with 4 to 6 and 6 to 4 and stuff like that. So again, still very, very, very early going on there, but I can try and dig somebody just posted a link with an example someplace earlier. So.
And what I do at the end is I put all the links in the show notes in the actual YouTube description. So that will definitely be available for those of you that are watching the non-live version of this video. Let's see.
Oh, here's the issue that covers it. So there's a lot going on there.
Okay.
So we got everybody back. Okay, cool.
Yep. Good. Okay, so that answers IPv6. Hold on, let me just make sure I didn't miss a question. And then we have the link to Kubernetes AWS Authenticator. So no open questions yet, so please feel free to continue to ask. We have about 15 minutes left.
So it might be useful to talk a little bit more about the Kubernetes AWS Authenticator and sort of where it's heading to. I think, Joe, you might be able to give more context on that.
Yeah, so this is a Heptio Labs proof of concept thing. It's something that Moyer put together relatively quickly just to see how it would work. What it essentially does is it lets you create a token out of essentially a URL to the STS service that then gets executed by a component to be able to verify you. And so essentially what it does is have you prove to the Kubernetes cluster, I have access to this role, right? I can act as this role or I can act as this user. And then that essentially becomes a token that gets passed along through kube control. Now, the way that this gets plugged in is a little bit funky right now in terms of you have to essentially go through and hook it up to the Kubernetes cluster directly, and then whenever you call it, you have to essentially execute a command to get a token. You use that token as a parameter into kube control. There's work lighting up in a couple of different places with SIG CLI to essentially make this authentication stuff be built in as a plugin for kube control. So we want to definitely streamline that over time. And it's something that we're going to be probably moving out of labs and putting a little bit more effort and time in, just because it seems like there's a lot of interest around it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think the one thing that I like about the authenticator is I don't have to really typically if I create a cluster using kops, for example, and now I want to manage that cluster from a different machine. If a kops cluster is created, I get all my kube config on that, and I can manage the cluster from there. But otherwise, I'll have to kind of have the Kubernetes cluster configuration stored separately, IAM credentials, like let's say for Kube2 IAM stored separately. I have two disconnected sort of set of credentials that I need to manage. With Authenticator, essentially, you can have one set of credentials, talking all in the IAM language and continue with that.
And we're talking about ways to map between IAM roles or credentials, essentially the user ARNs or the role ARNs, into Kubernetes users in a more generic way, so that you don't have to, because like if you read the thing right now, you have to put an entry in this file for essentially every user that you want to map in from the IAM world to the Kubernetes world. We want to do some work to sort of make that be more, hey, grab this part of the ARN and promote that to being the Kubernetes name in that way, in this way. So that's one of the things that we're actually looking at. Mm. But I think Moyer did a great job of documenting this. So definitely take a look. If you have feedback on it, let us know. Feel free to file some issues there, and it's something that we're going to be putting a little bit more effort into.
Just see if we have any more questions lined up here.
See pointers to IPv6 stuff, KubeV6.
Yep.
Yeah, I'm excited about, I do want to make progress on V6, and so I think hopefully we'll start cracking that egg open.
Yeah. Armand Oserna, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, says we're experiencing issues using the default Nginx ingress controller around delay of Nginx configuration causing 503s. You kind of hinted at this before. I think as far as like when you're using a label, and if you're making a configuration change, right, you have the 1 in 10 chance or whatever it is of the user getting a 503 or whatever.
There's a delay before the Nginx configuration gets set up. But typically, I don't know too much about the Nginx controller itself, but this is, fundamentally you're building distributed systems. In a lot of cases, distributed systems, things will get out of sync. You will have, it's just not possible to make sort of a clean boom, we're going to make a change here. there's a couple of things that people use to actually deal with this. Number one is that they do a drain when they're removing something from a service. And so if you're going to do something like change a label, yeah, or shut down a pod, this is why we have essentially some of these hooks, these lifecycle hooks in the pods. You can instrument your code such that it starts answering with an error to the what is it, the readiness probe, right? And so what you can do is you can take yourself unready, wait for all the current requests to actually drain. At that point, like you can wait until the configuration is actually good and the Nginx controller, the ingress controller is caught up. Then you go ahead and you shut that pod down and you're actually good to go. So if you can do a graceful shutdown as you actually remove stuff, you're not going to be seeing 503s like that. And so, so there you go. The sort of, that's how do you drain nodes, but I think it's a similar type of thing of like when you want to turn down pods, make sure that you do it in a responsible way. I think a lot of times when you're doing distributed systems and you're managing this stuff, a lot of times you got to be patient. These things happen slowly. So, right, it's like a big part of this is okay, I'm going to drain the stuff. I'm going to leave it for a few minutes to make sure that everything is settled, and then I'll actually start rotating some stuff out. As developers, we want to hit the button and see it happen right away. But in some ways, that's the bad instinct, right? Like the best SREs, when you see them operate, they're very deliberate. Even if the world's falling apart, they're very careful about what they're doing and they plan it out. It's a certain skill to be able to keep that calmness and actually go slow as you're actually doing stuff.
And he's currently typing, so let's see if that answers his questions. I hope. And thanks, Craig, for asking some follow-up. And now we can physically see Arun, so that's good.
Are you doing the Movember thing, Arun?
I am actually. It's mid of the month, so at reInvent is going to be a lot denser and bushier.
Yes.
So
maybe I'm thinking I should have thought about this earlier. Maybe next year, the Kubernetes community, we should start a Movember movement. Let's see how many in Kubernetes community can do Movember.
Amen.
I was pretty bushy for a while, but my wife was like, "That's it, shave it off." And so now
you gotta get some beard oil or a beard balm, Joe.
Yeah.
Trust me, I got some.
I was doing the beard oil. Okay, so
yeah. So our mom follows up with he has a high density staging environment that causes a lot of problems with it. Makes sense that the drain is necessary. I had assumed it had more to do with how Nginx was reloading the config on ingress changes.
Yeah, that's where I was going with that question, George.
Yeah.
Nginx, while a really awesome technology and has powered a lot of the internet for a long time, it does require the reload, and that can sometimes have a bit of an effect on other streams flowing through the Nginx controllers.
Yeah.
So I think that's part of the reason why we're kind of interested in Envoy and the work we've been doing around Contour. I don't know if, Joe, you want to speak to that?
I actually wanted to ask about that stuff too and kind of get an update from you guys on all of that, because a lot of companies, Liquid Web included, is looking for, like, Nginx is great, but it's just not for distributed systems of what we're trying to do here. So
yeah, so I mean that's why we invested in Contour. It's still very early. We're working hard on it. The biggest thing that we're looking at, the two things that are sort of next on the docket for Contour, which are going to really sort of move it to the next level, is going to be S&I support, which is coming in Envoy, which lets it terminate TLS, and that's really a bare minimum feature. And that's going to be available through the new API that Envoy is using, which is gRPC based versus their old HTTP thing. Now that gRPC API is probably not user facing, but it's again moving towards Envoy being very dynamic, very efficient in terms of how you can actually dynamically reconfigure it, which is one of those things that honestly Nginx, or at least the free version of Nginx, struggles with.
Yeah, and Dave Cheney just actually published a blog post, which I linked in the channel there, on how he explains how doing it with Envoy's new API will get rid of polling, like, entirely. It'll just...
So Contour and Envoy versus Traffic. So Traffic is great. I honestly don't have that many miles with it. The impression that I get is that especially with like the debug pages and stuff like that, Traffic is more of a sort of single service, sort of like more of a be able to feel it, touch it type of thing versus something that you would necessarily deploy at scale. That being said, that's my initial impression. I don't necessarily have super deep knowledge there, so I don't want to.
Right. I'll just add to that because we've actually tried to use it, and it actually works really well. But it's very single instance oriented. It's not meant for running in a clustered kind of method. So things like SSL certificates, which it actually can handle for you, which is fantastic. You can have 8 instances running, but all 8 instances are going to try to get a certificate for the same domain, right? So there's things like that haven't been considered. In terms of its reliability and ease of use, it's great for a starter project or kind of a single app on a single server or something like that. So,
so let's see. So LAX77 asking about Helm and Spinnaker. I don't want to lose that one. Yep. But on the PMC Graph, was asking about running it as a daemon set or running it on a small number of nodes, or how do you want to run? I think if you're talking about a production cluster, it may make sense to actually have an isolated set of ingress nodes that you're actually using to run your ingress, and having those be somewhat isolated from the rest of it. You can still do that with daemon sets and taints and tolerations and that stuff, so you can use that mechanism to manage it. If you're running a small cluster with 10 nodes, you can probably get away with just running one on every node, but at some point it kind of feels a little bit silly. Depending on sort of where you're running and what your production looks like, you may want to go through some effort to actually streamline the network path coming to ingress. So it's very easy with a type equals load balancer type of thing pointing to your ingress to actually get something up and running. That won't necessarily be the most efficient networking path. If you do a little bit more sort of custom type of stuff, like I have an example in the Contour repo about deploying Contour with host networking and the new network load balancer stuff on AWS. It's a very direct path, and it ends up being, depending on your environment, you may want to do on a couple clusters something a little bit more specialized to really get that path nailed down.
Yeah, and a lot of people here do, like we kind of do this where we have a actual load balancing layer that takes care of layer 4 in, and then that actually handles getting back to the cluster. And so we actually do run it as a daemon set. Our intention is every node is running that, and then that layer 4 load balancing layer, if you will, actually monitors the nodes and their health. And knows when they're healthy enough to route traffic to. So we kind of separate that out, where we still do run an ingress control on all of them. We don't do any specific nodes, but you might have nodes that are beefier, have better network connections that you want to use some labels for and have your ingress controller on. That's usually helpful as well in production. So.
And somebody's asking, do we archive these videos? We certainly do. They're available on the YouTube channel. So please share with friends. We definitely, so we're running out of time. So I do want to answer one more question here from LAX77 about, where was it? I just missed it. Is Helm and Spinnaker a good choice for CD? We could probably go into CI/CD combos all day long, but let's give them the TLDR if we would.
So I'll give you, the quick thing is that I think using Helm for deploying your own application is not the place where I think it really sings. I think that Helm really works best when you're deploying something that's been prepackaged for you and you're grabbing a Helm chart. Authoring your own Helm chart is not always a great experience. It's something that I know some folks are looking at improving. And even if you're going to be using it as CD, you still need something to trigger it. Now, Spinnaker really is a whole CD thing, and I don't know if you can use Spinnaker with Helm. It seems a little bit like there's a lot of overlap between those two things. The thing to keep in mind about Spinnaker is that it's a pretty big, complex system in and of itself. It has its own users database and its own UI, and it's a pretty hefty piece of technology to deploy for solving these problems. And last I looked, I'm sure you can do fancier things, but Spinnaker is very opinionated about doing blue-green deploys. in a way where you're not going to be using, say, Kubernetes deployments. You'd be using something like replica sets directly, and have Spinnaker be the one that actually drives those things. And a lot of this is just based on the assumptions around how AWS works, which was baked into Spinnaker early on. Now, that may be a snapshot that was a while ago. I know Spinnaker's been evolving past that, but that's at least been my snapshot the last time I looked at it.
So one of the things I would say is, we see customers using Jenkins, which is definitely in their wheelhouse. And Jenkins again can be set up multiple ways. You might have an existing Jenkins install, and you can use that to do CI/CD. I have a sample in the workshop that should be coming out soon. In addition, if you're an AWS customer, then we of course have a reference architecture on code commit, code pipeline. So you can literally say, I push my code, do the entire prod, and the entire sequencing is there as part of the reference architecture. And what I can do is after this, once I'm done with the chat here, I'll drop a link in the Slack channel, which can actually go into the show notes as well.
Good to know. And with that, we're kind of winding down here. We're a few minutes over to account for the technical issues.
So I do want to point out one other thing is that Alexis at Weaveworks has been pushing this term. I'm not sure if I like it or not, called GitOps. But this is the idea that you check in your stuff to Git, and then you have something that automatically knows how to actually read from Git and actually use that to drive the deploy. It feels a lot more lighter weight than something like Spinnaker in my mind. And so I'll put a post there. He has a couple of blog posts, and they have a tool that they've been working on for a while that goes into that.
Yep.
I haven't looked at it as closely as I want, but that's definitely an interesting answer in this space.
Yep. And if you have questions about that specifically, one of the Weaveworks guys does the European session with me earlier in today. So if you have specific questions about that, they definitely like to answer questions live. So with that, let's just wrap it up real quick. I'd like to thank you all for coming, and thanks to Amazon, Liquid Web, and Heptio for allowing their engineers to contribute back to the community. That's always awesome. And thanks to the CNCF, you each have earned the highly coveted Kubernetes water bottle, which I will be getting to you at some point. If you're an expert in Kubernetes and you want to help sit in a panel, help answer user questions, please feel free to ping me. We do these third Wednesday of every month, same time. The topics and all the information is in the topic in the Hash Office Hours channel. And with that, panel, do you have any final words?
Is this a water bottle that's big enough to hold a whole bottle of wine?
Ooh,
Nice. Yeah, the contributor bottle should be much larger and hold like just pure liquor.
But I think the way I would wrap up is, there is KubeCon coming. So if any of you guys are going to be there, we would love to talk to you and learn from you, and hopefully answer your questions as well.
Sure, same. We'll be there as well, and it's going to be a party. If I'm at my hotel room, I'm doing something wrong. I should be camping out at other people's hotels. So
the scheduling in the holidays might be tricky because the third Wednesday falls on usually when people are on holiday and things like that. However, in the channel, we are gonna try to run a session. It's just we're coming up to KubeCon. Everyone's trying to land a bunch of stuff at the same time. So it is very hectic. But we appreciate it when you come and you ask your questions. Please tell a friend about this. If you can share this at work, those of you that are doing Kubernetes professionally at work, things like that, we want to make this show valuable to you so that your boss wants you to come to this and learn about it and meet other people who are having the same problems in a kind of more fun manner than just posting in Kubernetes users and praying someone responds. So we try to bring a personal touch to this. So with that, thank you very much to our panel, and this concludes the office hours for this month. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, guys. Bye.
Bye everyone.
Bye.
Thanks.